Welcome to our Ask an Expert series. Specifically, we're talking today about gardening and landscaping. This is our second of the Ask an Expert series here at the MPL. My name is Jennifer Paquette, and I'm the Adult and Teen Services Coordinator here at MPL, and I will be the moderator for our panel this afternoon. I want to begin with a land acknowledgement. The Midland Public Library acknowledges and is thankful for the opportunity to work on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, which includes the Chippewa, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, and Odawa people. We especially acknowledge the Chippewa of Beausoleil First Nation and Rama First Nation, who are the stewards of the lands in and around Midland. We also recognize the Métis nationhood currently represented in our community by the Georgian Bay Métis Council. We recognize and deeply respect their ongoing and historical connections to these lands. These connections need to be clearly and overtly articulated as part of our collective agreement to make the work and the promise of truth and reconciliation real in our community. To start us off, I'd like to throw it to some of our esteemed guests on our panel to tell us a little bit more about themselves and the organizations that they represent. So we'll go alphabetically. We'll start with Kate. Kate, why don't you tell us about yourself?
So I have lived and gardened in Cinque County for 40 years now on the same property. So I've had the privilege of planting little trees that are now 40, 50 feet tall. And I'm a member of the Midland Penetang Field Naturalist Club, as well as of Ontario Nature. And I also have a connection with, I live really near Tiny Marsh, where I volunteer, and I'm on the board of the Mile Lake, Tiny Marsh, Matchdash Bay Conservation Association. And all of that kind of, the naturalists, the environment, and my garden all come together as part of what feeds my enthusiasm for being out there and messing around in the dirt.
That's great. And you run Return of the Native Nursery, which is open to the public, right?
Oh, yes. Yes, it is. Yes, I have a website. The garden, so my nursery is called Return of the Native. And it's just a garden gate sort of hobby operation, but it's quite busy, and there's a website, so returnofthenative.ca, and you can see a list of the plants that are for sale, and I do a blog and various other things.
Excellent. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes below for sure.
Oh, that'd be great.
And moving on, Kay, why don't you introduce us to you?
Okay, so another Brit or a Canadian who was born in Britain. I'm representing the Midland Garden Club as its president, which is how the invite came to me. But I'm also secretary of the Waimarsh Wildflower Group. And when there's no COVID-19, I am coordinator of the Georgian Bay Garden Tour, which unfortunately yet again is going to be not happening this year. I don't think it's worth the risk with where we are. Like Kate, I've been gardening, digging in the dirt for years, come from quite a few family members who were avid gardeners in England, and gardening feeds my soul. I have a lot of things metaphorically buried in my garden. I always used to say to my kids, if you want a nice mum, let me go in the garden for a couple of hours so I can debrief. If you don't, I'll be the witchiest, bitchiest mum, you know. And that's why I say the gardens you can use them to bury problems, because you can just let your mind go.
I think, well, both of those sentiments are beautiful. And I think it's no irony that we have two guests of a British background, knowing the infamous English garden and all of that sort of thing. So I like that we're rolling with that theme. On behalf of Midland Public Library, I want to thank you both for being here and being a part of our panel. It's a pleasure to speak with you, and I'm really excited for the advice that you have to give us this afternoon. So on that note, we'll jump right in. So my first question is going to be for you, Kay, and that is, when spring rolls around, we're all sort of itching to get out there in the garden, especially this year with being inside for so long and many being off work, so having the time. But last year, we had snow on May the 9th. And I remember that specifically because my father built a snowman on that day because he felt that he had never in his life before been able to build a snowman on May the 9th. So I wonder, when is the safest time to begin planting? And a second part of that question is, when's a good time? A lot of people are starting to grow things indoors prior to planting them outside. When is a good time to sort of start that step?
Okay, so let's answer the last question first.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of starting things indoors. Number one, don't start your tomatoes until at least April, otherwise they get very leggy. Two, don't start dahlias or pot up dahlias until about that time, because they also grow very quickly and get very leggy. I've learned this from experience and also listened to people's sage advice this year, and everything is looking a lot healthier. Safest thing to do is look at the packet. It will tell you how many weeks before you can set it out, and I still use May 24th as our frost-free date and work backwards from there, and that will give you a good idea of when to start your seeds.
Okay.
So the information is on most packets. In terms of somewhere like this spring, when we didn't have the heavy spring frost, nor did we last year, we had snow, but we didn't have the killing frost. So things like rhododendrons and azaleas and tree peonies that have their buds in the fall were beautiful because they didn't get killed by the frost. Everybody rushed out and got annuals this year when we had that warm spell, and I'm still hesitating to plant out annuals that like heat, because it suddenly got colder, and a few I had started to pot out are not very happy this morning. So I don't think there's an arbitrary. I think you really have to look at what the weather is doing. Potted perennials can go in even if it's cooler. If they're in pots and they're established perennials, they'll be fine. In fact, they'll be much happier in a cooler, wetter spring than they would planting them in June or July.
Okay.
So Kate may have very different in terms of what wildflowers, native flowers.
Anything to add, Kate?
Well, just a couple of things. So I totally agree with Kay on not starting too early, or your seedlings will get leggy, and that's because they don't have enough light. Now, I start things under lights, and I start things quite a lot earlier, like as early as February, because I'm growing perennials from seed. And some of those have quite a long growing time. Some of those have to be put in the fridge to go through a simulated winter, because they won't break their dormancy until they get the signal that, okay, winter has happened, I can now start to grow. So my first light table goes up in February, and then more and more, and so on. And so most people are growing, who are growing vegetables, those are annuals, and late April, early May is a good time to go. And I guess one other tip, if you're starting vegetables or any seeds inside, is to have a little fan to provide air circulation, because there's something called damping off, which is a fungus, which can actually just make your little seedlings rot at the soil line, and they'll just keel over and die. And that's because there's not enough air circulating. So you just get a cheap little fan and you keep the air moving around your seedlings.
Interesting.
but it's awfully nice to have things growing indoors while there's still snow outside. It kind of cheers you up. So it's a good thing to do.
Gives you a little hope for the future. My one follow-up question to both of you is, when you say leggy, do you mean like flopping over, or what do you mean by leggy?
Tall, usually thin stems, and a tendency to flop over because they can't support. You can pinch out the buds, but rule of thumb is usually the first set of leaves don't touch. The second set of leaves, when you start to get a cluster come in, then you can pinch those out and it will make it bushier. But sometimes it's very hard to pinch out growth when you're excited to see it. And I often forget to do that. So.
Fair.
The reason it's leggy is it's stretching out for more light. It wants more light because usually your windowsill doesn't have enough light for it. And so your conditions aren't great for a little seedling, which is why it's better to start in May when there's more light coming in through the window, and then they don't get so leggy.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. All right. Next question. This one's going to go to you, Kate. Midland is now designated a bee city municipality, which is committed to providing pollinator habitats within the municipality's borders. And I can see as the weather continues, you can see more of these bee-friendly gardens and spaces pop up in and around Midland. So what can we do as individual gardeners or landscapers at home to support pollinators? And so that's my first half of the question. What can we do at home as individual gardeners to help these pollinators?
Okay, and before I answer that, I just want to give a shout out to Collingwood, which there's a group of young people in Collingwood who are called Pollinator Collingwood, and they are working with the town to plant native plants, and I supply some of those, and it's very encouraging to see the next generation coming along and doing this work and learning about why we would do that. And so the reason I have my nursery is mainly so as to have a source of native plants, because those are the ones that support native insects. They are the ones that are able to be consumed by the larvae of butterflies. We all know about the milkweed. That is the host plant for the monarch. Well, almost all native plants are a host plant for some form of butterfly, and some butterflies go to different plants, and some are just focused on one, like the monarch is. And similarly, bees and other insects go to flowers for their pollen, nectar, and they're more attracted to the native plants. And this is because the species have evolved together over millennia. They've adjusted to each other, and they consume. There have been studies done on the health of pollinators that are consuming plants from Europe and Asia, which is quite a lot of what we plant in our gardens, versus the ones that grow here naturally. And the nutrition is better for them if they're consuming native pollen and native nectar. And the other important factor about growing native plants is that supports species up the food chain. You may find it a bit weird, but I garden for caterpillars. I want to see caterpillars on my plants. A healthy plant will not be killed off by caterpillars, and birds need caterpillars in order to support their nestlings. Nestlings don't eat seeds. They eat protein, they eat high calorie caterpillars. That's what's easy to digest. And so when you see the birds flitting around at this time of year, they're looking for insect prey to feed their nestlings. And if you don't have any caterpillars in your yard, your pair of chickadees are not going to successfully raise a brood. So what can you do? Well, there's a lot of information out there to find out what plants are native. My favorites are purple coneflower, anise hyssop, New England aster, and all these are beautiful plants that anybody would be delighted to have in their garden. But they are also great for the species that live. You live in your home, outdoors is home to so many other creatures. And you have to think of that. It's not just your space, it's their space. So you have to provide for them.
I was going to ask about we've sort of mentioned the difference of native plants versus non-native plants. And so you gave us some examples of native ones that are great. What is like a common plant that, you see often a lot of places that isn't native, like that folks use in their gardens regularly?
Yes, or, I mean, if you go to any garden center, there is spreads of petunias in all different shapes and colors. Interestingly enough, I don't get a lot of, if you go into garden centers, just think how often you come across bees, wasps, or insects going around the plants. Because that will tell you how enticing they are to the insects and bees that help pollinate and also keep your garden healthy, because they often prey on a lot of the bugs that people get upset about. You don't need chemicals if you have a well-balanced habitat. There is a tendency to, people want a lot of color. After a cold winter, they're looking for color, and annuals seem to be the go-to for that. But if you balance your garden with perennials and native plants, you can get color from spring until late fall. My garden, I have color all the time. I go through the yellow and orange shades, which is the daffodils and the snowdrops and the crocus. Now my garden is in its blue phase with forget-me-nots, which, by the way, are a very effective mulch because they cover the bare ground so it doesn't dry out. And they're very easy to get rid of. And then it moves into the hotter colors. I think, and if you plant a lot of annuals, they take a lot of water. That's the other consideration that is not in the questions, but I think Kate would agree with me, is gardening can take a lot of water, which is a very precious resource. And I think we need to steer people to gardening that is self-sufficient. I don't water my garden. The first year the plants get watered. After that, they have to tough it out.
I'm the same.
Yeah. And you actually end up with much healthier plants because they can tolerate a very dry spell like we're having right now. And
yeah, because if people water too much, then the roots aren't reaching down deep to where the moisture should be, and you're keeping the roots at the surface, and the plant is then left defenseless when it all suddenly dries out. So that's such a good point.
Nice. Yeah, it's not something I'd actually ever considered before, how much water annuals take, or even your point about like how many bees do you see flying around, like when you're going shopping. That'll tell you what'll help your pollinators and what won't. Very interesting points. Good stuff. I'm learning so much. And my second half of that question, and we'll come back to the caterpillars because that's a hot topic these days. But it kind of goes part and parcel to my second half of the question, which came from one of my colleagues, is how do I attract birds to my backyard? And so if you're planting things that are good for your pollinators and good for your insects, well, that's going to attract your birds because they'll be coming for lunch and for dinner.
Make sure you've got somewhere for them to hide.
Right. Okay.
Like a shrub or something. They need to be able to hide so they can survey the scenery and make their move.
Okay, okay. Good advice.
I'd actually just like to add something there, which is don't just have a tree, a specimen tree, and then flower beds and a lawn and so on. You should have a mid-level. You should have shrubs, which generally shrubs and something like a Virginia creeper or a vine, that's where the nests go, those mid-levels. And often those are the fruiting plants that will also provide nutrition, like the high bush cranberry or the red osier dogwood and so on. All those are consumed by birds. And another very important thing for birds is leave your leaf litter on the ground. That has so much important little grubs and all sorts of things. They'll pick through it and they'll find nutrition there. But if you've raked it as clean as a kitchen floor, there's nothing for them to eat.
Hey,
and by the way, you make a great mulch. You have a question later on if I'm using leaves or straws for mulch. I don't buy mulch.
really? That's well, I mean, like, I'm just in shock here. I can't wait to tell my husband that we don't have to rake the leaves. We should just leave them where they are, because anything that gets me out of that task, I'm happy with.
Yeah, I always tell people that the tree made itself the most perfect nutrition, which was the leaves that it drops are exactly what it needs to carry it through the winter and nutrition for the following year. And then we rake that away and we might put some sort of synthetic fertilizer. It's totally not what the tree wants. It needs that protection from frost or from extreme drought. And just kind of, you can tidy it up into a circle. Don't heap it up around the trunk because that would cause rot, but leave it its leaves. It likes those leaves.
Okay, interesting. Well, let's turn our attentions to the mulch question. And I'll ask it to you, Kay. So how important is mulch for your garden? And so, I mean, like you both have just mentioned about how it is. I've mentioned to you prior, before we started recording, that I'm not a huge gardener myself, so forgive me that taking this angle with the mulch, but I often put it in because it keeps the weeds down and I have less to do. But I suppose that it sounds like there's more to mulch than just keeping the weeds down. It's about keeping the soil.
I think there are two aspects or more to mulch. One is people use mulch to make the garden look attractive, which is why we have all those terrible colors of like bright orange, which is not natural. If you're looking for mulch as functional, to cover the ground, to reduce weeds, why do you need to be used commercial? We've already talked about leaves. You can move them around your plants. They will do the same thing. They're still brown and they decompose and the worms will pull them into the soil. And straw also will break down fairly quickly too, whereas the mulch that you buy does not break down very quickly.
Okay.
Kate can probably give you much more scientific background to mulch than I can.
Yeah. Anything to add, Kate, on mulch?
So I agree. My favorite mulch is well decomposed leaves. I save leaves, I collect them from other people and I kind of stack them and let them rot down, and then that makes a beautiful mulch. I don't really like the look of wood chips, except on paths. It's nice on a path. And you have to be careful with fresh wood chips because they actually steal the nitrogen from the ground. So they're actually impoverishing your plants. But I would just say one more thing, which is against mulch. You should keep some areas which are just bare earth. And that's usually at the in a path, somewhere that's well traveled. And the reason for that is that most of our native bees are solitary nesting bees. There are 400 species in Ontario, and they nest in the ground. They don't have hives. Each mother bee makes a hole in the ground, and that's her nest. And if you've mulched everywhere, that bee cannot get at the ground. There has to be bare soil somewhere in your space for the native bees. So I'm in favor of mulch, but also don't forget the native bees.
Oh, that's great. So newsflash, there are other uses for those leaves that we are raking up or not raking up in the fall, if you're in my case now. You touched on it a little bit earlier, Kate. So my next question is for you, and it's regards to pests. So you've mentioned caterpillars is a big one for folks right now, and those gypsy moth caterpillars. So pests can be a big problem for a lot of gardeners. I did a quick poll of the staff here at MPL, and the biggest culprits we've identified were those gypsy moths, grubs, and squirrels. So how can we deal with pests in our garden?
Okay, well, I do think that one of the issues that we as a species have is that we like to control everything. And we just have to be a whole lot more forgiving of nature and let nature do her thing. And often nature balances everything out. There are too many caterpillars, a bird comes in and cleans them off. I spent a very nice afternoon once with a book in a lawn chair, watching a little warbler just picking off every caterpillar that was on, every looper that was on one of my rose bushes. I was much happier to have her do the work than have to do it myself. But that's not going to happen overnight, because if your space has been sort of drenched in chemicals and so on, the balance of predators and prey insects is not going to be there. It'll take a year or two of patience to bring everything into balance. Generally, I would say don't agonize over it. If there are holes in the leaves, that's a good thing. That means that plant is healthy, something is eating it, and as long as it doesn't have any systemic insecticide in it, then whatever is eating it is going to flourish and make your whole outdoor space a lot healthier. Just to talk about gypsy moth, so this is very controversial. I think if you read what foresters are saying, is basically spraying, there's not a lot of point. This is an insect that we bought to this land. It's ours as a European species, our European gypsy moth. And it's a huge nuisance. But it goes in 7-year or thereabout cycles, and it builds up and then it crashes. And most trees will survive. Of course, if that's your favorite oak in your backyard is one of the percentage that doesn't, that's not much consolation, because you're not looking at your space on a landscape-wide basis. You're looking at it as just your space, your tree. And there are things you can do to try and control the gypsy moth, and wrap burlap around the trunk and various other things. If there's a very much loved tree, there's also an insecticide you can inject into it. But I think basically we have to relax more, and we have to roll with the punches of the damage that we have done by bringing invasive species to this continent, and we have to try and strengthen our native species so that they're not kind of trying to occupy the space with one hand tied behind their back, because our native species are exposed to a full range of pests and diseases. Whereas the gypsy moth, there's nothing that, very little. There are a few birds that consume the gypsy moth caterpillar, but basically it's not like a native species that has to fight for its survival against all sorts of other native predators. It's here, and it didn't bring its predators with it.
Mm. Nice. Thanks.
Okay, if I can just jump in with a couple of tips. If you have lilies, Asiatic lilies, tree lilies, which I have a few of in my garden, they are very prone to a very fluorescent orange lily beetle, which if you're out in your garden in the spring and the sun has been on it, they're very easy to see and very easy to pick off. If you do it then, you might miss a few, but you won't get the infestations that can happen. And the other one is the Japanese beetle. I have found that there is a white spider with a yellow splotch. Sorry, can't give it its proper name, but I've noticed over the last few years that every time a plant has Japanese beetles on it, there's one of those spiders. So I have a feeling the spider is maybe feeding on the Japanese beetles. But I go out and pick them and put them in a pot of water with a little dish soap, and I'll sometimes, if it's very hot, I'll do it a couple of times a day. But I've also learned if there's or you water around the base of the plants, they don't come out of the soil. They need it to come out of the soil. So when it's very wet, we don't get such bad infestations. And I know they're two of the ones that, if you have roses or lilies, are more likely to get you as a gardener a bit antsy about seeing your plants eaten.
Oh, well, that's great. Great advice. And I like your note, Kate, too, about we just need to not need to control everything. We need to let it go and relax. That's great advice. A lot to unpack there for sure. My next question will be for you, Kay, and that is, as I've admitted already, I'm not particularly fond of gardening. And so I'm looking for plants that are easy to care for and make your garden look beautiful, kind of like a set it and forget it sort of situation. Although hearing you guys answer the first couple of questions, maybe I've just been doing it wrong this whole time. So what kind of recommendations do you have for someone like myself who doesn't enjoy gardening?
I think the first thing, you have to decide what kind of gardener you are. And a piece of advice I was given many years ago when I didn't have much money and didn't have a lot of time to garden, went to a nursery and was blown away by the garden and made some comments. And the man who ran it said, "Do you like your garden?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, that's the important thing. Not whether it looks good to other people, it's whether you like your garden." And that applies to somebody like yourself who doesn't like gardening. You've got to have a garden that you want to go out in and play around with because it satisfies you. Don't have a garden that you're doing for show or to appeal to other people, because then it's going to be more of a labor. So the best thing to look at is perennials, the old tried and true peonies, and you can go through the season, but make a mix of those perennials and some of the native plants, because they will look after themselves too. Some of them self-seed, so they're continuous. So what are the staples in my garden? The things that I know will come up every year and I don't really have to do much to. I have a lot of peonies. I have tree peonies. I have daylilies. They come in all kinds of shapes and colors. I have iris. Having said that, iris need to be thinned every once in a while. And the hardest plant to give away or sell at a plant sale, I've noticed, because they multiply so quickly. I'm just thinking out in my garden, definitely shrubs, and barberries are wonderful. There's a lot of color, so you can really vary it, and they're very hardy and have some fruit. Asters, the more native asters for your fall. Primroses, primulas in the spring, if you're looking for color throughout. One piece of advice, if you see wonderful adverts for this is a new species or plant, this is new this year, don't buy it. Wait, because chances are, if it's brand new on the scene, it hasn't been studied long enough to know it survives. So one of the things that happened with coneflowers. Like there's the native coneflower, and then there are many variations, and there started to be fluorescent oranges, pinks, doubles, because they were being hybridized. And a lot of people commented that they were great the first year, and then the second year they were not so great.
Okay.
So, and don't rush. Plant your garden gradually. Be patient. Gardening is all about being patient, right, Kate?
It is, yes. There's always next year.
Oh, that's great.
Before we started, it depends who you are as a person. So some people want instant gardens with lots of color, and they may be happy to go out and spend a lot of money every year to put those annuals in to do it. But if you want a garden that's easier to manage, you need to look more at perennials with maybe bursts of color from some annuals. But and annuals take work because they often need deadheading.
Right, right. That's
and I'm sure Kate's got some very good suggestions for native
yes,
plants.
that's great advice. Thanks, Kate. And over to you, Kate. Anything to add for a gardener like myself who doesn't really enjoy it?
Okay, well, I have a few ideas. So I'll start with shade. Everybody thinks hostas. I'm not so keen on hostas. There are a number of really lovely native plants. One of my favorites is called black cohosh. It's also known as black snakeroot, fairy candles. It's actually widely available at commercial nurseries. And it has the most lovely foliage, very cut foliage. And then in September, these beautiful arching spires of white flowers that attract tons of butterflies and bees emerge. It's very dramatic. So that is my top shade plant, I'd say. For spring, I would advocate Virginia bluebells. Beautiful color in the spring, and you plant one and in about 3 years you'll have just a drift of it through your shade bed. It's just a beautiful plant. The first flowering native of spring is called bloodroot. Very pretty little white flower with interest. So that's the shade. And then sort of sun and shade. Well, sun, we'd have definitely anise hyssop, which flowers early in the season, right through to late in the season. It has fragrant foliage that you can make tea with. It tastes of anise. And the height of summer, my favorite plant is the native purple coneflower, and that grows equally well in sun or shade, and it self-seeds gently. You'll get more of it. And then, as Kay said, into fall, the asters, the fall flowering asters are very important for pollinators when they're feeding up for winter or for migration. So those are my suggestions.
Those are some great options to add to our gardens locally. Kate, my next question is about the soil. Is there anything that you need to do to your soil in order to support growth?
Most native plants prefer a low nutrient environment. They don't want enriched soil. People come and say, oh, I've just made a bed with triple mix. And I'm kind of bite my tongue because really they didn't need to do that. Native plants will grow, most of them in average soil. I very much urge against adding anything with peat to your garden. That is not only depleting really important wetland habitat that is under threat, but it's also in our area not unless you happen to have a wetland, the plants that you're growing are not likely to need it. Now, obviously, there are plants that are not native to our area, like the rhododendrons and the azaleas, that like a more acidic soil, but there's other ways of achieving that without using peat. So I would urge against doing that. So generally, unless your soil is very compacted, in which case you would need to loosen it up a bit, compacted by having been walked on or driven on or whatever, just add a mulch of some kind, leaf litter or compost, and let the organisms in the soil do the work of breaking the stuff you put on top of the soil, the compost or leaf litter, and dragging that down to where it can be used by the plants. And don't do too much. Sometimes we just work too hard and we're actually not making things better.
Good advice. Anything to add, Kay? Any other tips?
Well, I was thinking, just as laughing to myself when Kate said not working too hard. I'm known for having a great tolerance for weeds because I have a huge garden. And right now with this dry spell, they've got my garden soil covered. And I am not opposed to pulling them up and then laying them on the soil to burn and still keep it covered. I think it's, we get too carried away with the aesthetics of how things look and maybe become too prey to, it's got to be neat and tidy and lineal. And one of the things that when I took over with the Georgian Bay Garden Tour was looking for gardens, as I say, that have soul. You go into the garden and you get pulled this way and that way, and you just get the feeling from the garden, as opposed to what I call soulless gardens with a lot of bare rock, almost the same plants and shrubs ad infinitum, and they're more for show. I don't know that they give the pleasure, and they certainly aren't, on the whole, good habitats for our native species, or places for birds to get food. So, I mean, you can probably tell that Kate and I are very similar in our way of looking at gardens. Mm-hmm. And that's not everybody's way of looking at it. It's one that suits us. Mm-hmm. So some people love to come to my garden and just wander around, but some people get uncomfortable because it's not perfect. Mm. And as I said to you before, you need to decide, is the garden going to be in control of you, or are you going to be in control of the garden? So I always look at my garden and say, you can tell me when I'm walking around what might need to be done, but I am not obliged to do it.
My husband always tells me the perfect is the enemy of the good. So don't despise.
Yes. Can I just throw in a couple of things here?
Oh, yes, please do.
Towards the end. One is periwinkle, and goutweed, to me, should be banned from being sold because they are so invasive. And I have spent the last couple of years having to go into the bush around me because when I was tending my garden, I didn't realize that just a small piece of periwinkle will survive. And yes, they do climb hedges and fences. And I'm trying now to eradicate it because they will smother the ground, which is why people plant them around trees. And it's fine if you can contain it. But when you go and cut it, put the cuttings in a plastic bag, tie it up, and put it in the sun so it cooks. Because if you put it in the compost or in recycling or anything else, it will grow. And goutweed is very much that same. Just needs a little bit. It's like crabgrass. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, I learned that lesson myself.
I'm glad you raised that, because that's a key thing for people to know about invasive species. I have a list on my website, and when we finish this, I'm going out to do battle with lily of the valley, which is a very invasive species on this continent. And the three big ones are goutweed, lily of the valley, and periwinkle, in my view. It's because they're a real threat to natural spaces where trilliums should be growing. I drive along the road and I see carpeted with periwinkle, and there should be trilliums there, and it's just sad.
Yeah, and you do need to be very conscientious about how you get rid of it, because that's why there are patches, random patches in woods and on the roadside. It's because it's and it will survive. It's incredibly hardy.
Well, that's one of the problems we have at Tiny Marsh and everywhere at the Cinquecane Forest and so on. People come and dump their yard waste and they think, oh, it's not going to do any harm. It's just, going to decompose. But no, that yard waste will have the seeds of invasive species that they've been growing in their yard, and they escape into the forest. And we have it happening at Tiny Marsh, and it's a major problem. I'd sooner, in a way, they left an old fridge there than a pile of invasive species. Please,
there's something might make it a home.
Take the door off the fridge, but don't bring me a pile of your yard waste.
It's interesting to put it in perspective. I did a very brief stint out of university with the landscaping company my cousin owns, and I remember there was one property that had planted periwinkle in lieu of grass. And I hated going to said property to maintain it. But I mean, I told you I hated gardening, and so I definitely hated it when I was doing it for money. But that is great. Well, I want to thank both Kate and Kay for joining us this afternoon. In addition to the advice that you've given for myself and for our viewers, I especially love your philosophy and how much you've shown me that gardening is about more than just the garden, and it's about us as human nature and our relationship to the nature around us. So thank you for that. It went a lot deeper than I was even expecting. So and I think that's really great and beautiful to consider. I want to let our viewers know that they can stay tuned to our website and our social media channels for our next Ask an Expert event this fall. And that is it for us this afternoon. We wish you both a thank you again and a great afternoon. I'll let you get back out to the garden now.